Good evening, everyone. I'm gonna kick it off. I want you to indulge me for a minute. I'm gonna ask you to take a breath in a minute and take it in slow and just hold it for a second and then let it out. It's nice if you do it through your nose. You don't have to. This won't be very different than some of the things I do as soon as kids come into my office. They come in, they look very stressed. They've got little lines in their forehead. They have that sort of harried look. But do that with me just right now, and then let it out. You heard that with everyone. In that moment, you became present. In that moment, everything in the world out there was not bothering you. It was just a moment. And you were more in touch with yourself. You were more in touch with your body, the signals in your body. And in that moment, you had like a tiny fraction of agency. Don't worry, it'll be gone soon because you have your cell phones near you, and we now know that the proximity of just having these devices anywhere on you or even next to you, shut off and upside down, signal your brain to check them. In fact, they're almost like mental kryptonite, so the closer they are, the more that they're going to affect you. So the society is working very, very fast. Most of the stress that you carried in with you tonight, try to focus off of that for a little bit as we begin to explore what agency is. So I'm going to just tell you a little bit about what my experience is like. When the children come in, it's changed over the years, and they used to come in a lot happier. I've been doing this now at about the 25, almost 30-year mark. And I've seen something change. And at first I couldn't put my finger on it. The parents too, they're, in fact, nobody really gets to the waiting room quick and reads the outdated magazines anymore. They barely make it to each appointment. They're often late. Parents come in, they're breathing really, really heavy. They're stressed. They're a little bit discombobulated. They're a little bit off their game. More and more I've been seeing this. More and more calls midweek or later, there's problems, meltdowns. More and more kids are coming in for kind of first time who never needed to see a therapist but are just completely sort of breaking apart, if you will. Became interested in whether or not this was just something that I was seeing in my practice or where I live in the Boston area. It's a very stressful place up there too. And was interested in doing a project about the anxiety that I was seeing that in fact I felt was really contagious, because when I was in the office I was picking it up. It felt like I was going home very tense. I partnered with Paul Napper, who's here tonight, and who works in a very different kind of space than I do. Also has a doctorate in psychology, but has a background in finance and international relations, and works mostly in organizations and businesses and leadership, and he's seeing it too. So we decided to sort of work from this idea of like, well, maybe just families are anxious, maybe it's just folks that we see. Could it be bigger? We put our heads together and we decided to see if whether or not anxiety really was climbing. And so and this may not be news to you if you read the paper, if you see the news reports. Anxiety's been on the climb for a long time. We can go into detail about it later. But we all feel it. We all feel the effects of it. And all the people we love are more anxious than ever. And that got us wondering if whether or not there was some other way to deal with this, because we were being asked, for the people that were showing up in our lives for work, is there some way you can help us? And frankly, on my end, I just didn't feel right continuing to send kids on for psychopharmacology. Sometimes it was really useful. Or I do what's called cognitive behavioral therapy, and we would see them more frequently. And it seemed like it was a little bit like, yeah, we could stop it, but then it would come back pretty quick. Was there something else that was out there? And we mined our different sets, if you will, data sets of experience, and discovered through a lot of discussions and then talking with colleagues, there may have been various sort of practices or ways of thinking that we boiled it down to principles. Because some of the people that we were seeing were doing pretty well. If anything, some of them were thriving. Did they have something that we would want? That's what started us on this journey it's been about a 5-year project. And along the way, we set out to interview about 100 people, different parts of the country, sort of a case study-like report process to sort of get some stories and find out, like, people who seem to have agency, and that's how we wanted to house this thing, that people who have the ability to pause, stop, reflect, had more control in their lives. They seemed to have less anxiety. So was there something in that? So that's how we opened this up. And I got the chance to read some of your book, which I'm absolutely loving. And if you haven't yet, you have to read this book. I had sort of a little bit of a jealousy. I don't know if I could have gone through any of these experiences. They're really tremendous, but a part of me wishes, and maybe still I will.
I might have saved you the trouble on a couple of them. So
perhaps. And while I'm reading through, I'm seeing all these examples of agency. But tell people a little bit about sort of your story.
Yeah, sure. I mean, what an honor to be here, and thank you all for braving the cold to have us be in conversation. And to watch my free therapy session, which is what I'm doing for this hour. I'm excited about it. The book journey, so my background, as was sort of stated in the intro, is a bit of a mixed bag. I'm currently running a company here in New York that we're calling the Justice Department, no affiliation with the Department of Justice. I sort of cheekily called that. And it, to really empower women-owned businesses, women creatives, and help them with all the things to kind of get them on a path to success. So pretty excited about that. And before that, worked in startups, worked in nonprofits at a pretty senior level, but in that culture of busy, like very much in that, I worked for companies that created a lot of the attention-demanding technology and products and services that, I'm sorry for all those things, but like that was definitely part of what I was doing for most of my career. And over the course of that, in the middle of that, I had a baby about 9 years ago. Her birthday was just last week. And when she was born, I realized in that moment that I didn't really know what I believed about the big questions in life and the things. I worked at Google at the time, ironically, and where everything was a short Google search away if I didn't know the answer. As a lawyer and as a mother, I was like, what do I do if I don't know the answer to something? I could Google it. But that there were going to be the set of questions that I knew I wouldn't be able to Google. So things like, what happens when you die? Is there a God? How do you find happiness? Those sort of things. So I decided I would try to figure it out because I was a lawyer, I liked knowing things, and I was going to try to take the time and figure that out. So over the course of many years, started doing research and doing all of these non-religious, like not true religious things. I sort of skipped the big box religions and set out into like spiritual backcountry, if you will. So I did everything from Soul Cycle to silent meditation retreat to Burning Man, which I told my parents was a conference in the desert. And they luckily didn't know what Burning Man was, so they believed me. And so I did all these different things trying to figure out what I believe. So the book is, with a humorous, lighthearted tone, but definitely like searching into some bigger things and trying to, take that time to pause and reflect, as you alluded to, and figure out what I believed, at least, were the answers to some of those questions.
When I was reading through some of it, it actually reminded me of some of the late teen and early 20s kids that I've been seeing who are sort of going through what is the purpose of my life?
Yeah.
Sort of existential dilemma. And you expect that around that age, but I've been finding, and this goes back to this idea of climbing anxiety and stress in the society. I had a fifth grader in the other day, came in, he was in his basketball shorts, even though it was cold out. And just, plopped down on the little couch, like not far from where my desk is, and just, like, what's wrong? And his mother came in and she was stressed. He hates school, everything's bad, whatever, and I was like, okay, why don't you just give us a few minutes? And she exited out to the waiting area. But he launched into this, when you die, what happens? Wow. So he's 11 years old, and it's not completely unusual, but from a developmental standpoint, you don't want that around 10, 11 years old. Right. You want that to be a little bit down the road where they have this cognitive mental ability to sort of handle the bigger picture, abstract thinking. where do I go? What's the meaning of life? What's the purpose of it? I was
Right.
having like a full-blown like existential dilemma.
What prompted it?
It was just school is terrible. I
So
hate
like,
school.
what's the point?
Yeah,
The whole-
he was going into some sort of very, I think at the base of it actually was more about some friendships and not feeling connected.
Right.
And I think that they live a life that is so accelerated today, certainly compared to when I was younger.
For
You probably
sure,
had the same
for sure.
experience. It just, and I've watched that speed up in their lives, and I think, here are these like little people just trying to form themselves. By the time you reach middle school, I was thinking because he's wearing these basketball shorts. By the time you reach middle school, if you're not really good at a sport, like a lot of the kids just bow out. They just stop playing the team sports. They're not good enough. They haven't been to the, either the specialty camps or the clinics. They just don't make the team, and that then fractures a lot of their social relationships.
Yeah.
The other piece I do think is, and I tend to see mostly boys and young men. Part of that is what I focus on, but it's also, they do tend to be overrepresented in at least the therapy child and adolescent domain until they're grown up, and then they don't go. They don't seek help. They don't, which is
never talk
unfortunate.
again.
That's
interesting.
But I think it's also because they're on screens a lot, and so the
The
average.
boys more than the girls?
Absolutely.
Oh, interesting.
Overall, once social media kicks in, middle school,
Then the girls start.
The girls are there, and it's hey, girls are catching up. This is great. They're actually getting closer and closer to where boys are on online activities when you pull it all together. But boys still have that because once they get into gaming.
Right.
And you think about that 6, 7, 8 hours a day, which is an average across the country.
Crazy.
It is, and that's not what they're doing at school. So they're on a screen-related device on average 7 to 8 hours a day. This is a Kaiser family report.
How
It's actually
old?
a couple
At
of.
what age?
It's somewhere around the 7 or 8 till about 15, 16 years old.
That's
that sweet spot.
horrifying.
Yeah,
That's really
yeah.
scary.
Yeah, a lot of the parents I work with are onto this, and the kids can be like, I'm the only one who doesn't get to play
Right,
Fortnite or something
right.
like that.
My daughter's not allowed to either.
And I'm like, good.
At all, yeah.
Good, because
Yeah.
there's just so much that's correlated to heavy use that's very bad, and we've seen it in the literature for a while. But I think about the missed opportunities. All that time, they're sedentary. They're not outdoors experiencing natural elements. They're not connecting with other kids.
Yeah.
And I think about that as sort of like the crisis in agency. And this was something that I forgot to mention earlier, but as we were wondering about the rise of anxiety, could we see this thing in a whole different way? Maybe it was that agency's gone down. And that agency, in fact, anxiety is like suffocating, declining, if you will, our agency. And if we could reverse that somehow, and that's really what this book is about, like if we could, using the principles that we learned from people who are successful with it, if we could up it, could we bring anxiety down? I mean, at least we feel we can.
Right. It's so interesting. My daughter, well, she's 9, and she's certainly, she's like a regular kid. But when I remember when she was in first grade and was getting ready for summer, we were talking to her teachers about what was she going to do that summer, and I was like, I don't know, she's just going to hang out and be bored. I don't know, like she'll do camp or something, but like I think she'll probably just be around a lot and sort of hanging out. And they were like, oh my gosh, you have to tell the other parents. Like, that's so great. I was like, well, I think it's really important for her to be bored because I think it teaches her to deal with herself. And like, she's an only child too, but it's just, I think it's important. It helps her creativity. I have no scientific data on this, and it's just my own theories of parenting. And they were like, no, but it's really true. And most of the other parents in the class are like, they've got them in math camp, and then computer camp, and then this camp, and that camp, and it's like really, really scheduled. And I get from a childcare perspective, like there's some realities around that.
Right.
That I totally get. But then it's also just the need to fill up all their time because they don't know how to be with themselves and just pause and be still and just sort of chill.
They say they're bored.
Yeah,
They
they
get
say they're
bored
bored,
really
and then it's like,
fast.
our tendency is to be like, okay, well, let's unbore you.
Yeah,
And
you
when
don't-
Zia says she's bored, I'm like, figure it out.
And
like,
boredom
go find something to do.
is great because if you just stay with it long enough, like, creativity is probably right around the corner.
Yeah.
There's probably going to be a moment where you kind of go through that, and then you're like, okay, now I have to start inventing and thinking of things in new ways.
I think that's right.
We've been to a couple of schools and talked about agency, and the teachers are saying that, particularly for the very young kids, if they don't have something every minute, they tune out immediately or start acting up because they're used to that because of the mostly electronic devices or hovering parents.
Yeah.
So and this goes, it goes deeper. People are afraid of the society. They're worried about things because of the 24/7 cable news cycle and all the images and messages that they get that make them more worried than they need to be. And so they're on their kids a lot, or they're always feeling that they're going to fall behind. And they're in a global economy now, and there's a lot of socially comparing ourselves to other people. So it's a normal human trait.
And then we have things like Instagram that actually give you
That's
a
right.
way in real time to compare your lives to,
and there you
or
are.
at least your Instagram life to other
That's
people.
absolutely right. I'm impressed that you don't schedule everything up. That's what most parents are doing. Right?
Yeah.
You have
So
that
can you
sense of-
tell her how great of a parent I am? She's
Yeah,
gonna
I will.
be
I will.
So set. I know. Right now she gets annoyed, but
They're
I'm
always.
like, come
And by
on,
the way,
trust me.
hour after hour in my office, every kid says that they're the ones who don't get the most compared to all the other kids in the town. And I know the town, so yeah.
You're like,
so
I'm
if you're a parent,
therapist
do
for
not
everybody.
buy that one at all. But it is. It's getting harder and harder, I think, to be a parent, and the messages are confusing. And one of our principles is check your intuition, which is about sort of using the sort of deeper wisdom and the knowledge you have, not being impulsive with it. But if you can get to a quiet spot and you're calm and you've done other good thinking, you've controlled your stimulation, you've associated right, you've used movement, all these other principles that work as you get to these later principles, you can kind of pause, take a moment and say, you know what, it's okay to be a little bit bored, or no, we can't fill up every minute.
Right.
Oh, I also wanted to you brought up camp, which I think is great. We were just at a camp conference in Nashville, Tennessee, and I've done them now for about 5 or 6 years. You can just imagine what fun this is. It's mostly camp directors, and they come from different parts of the country, and they were interested in child development. And this year was a little different than all the other years. More questions from the administrators and the staff and senior camp people about the stress of parents when they're dropping their kids off, and a lot of the parents are checking in to make sure things are okay while the kids are away
During
at
the
camp.
whole time.
And having more problems with kids getting off their devices. Once they're off their devices, they're thrilled.
They're allowed to bring their devices to camp?
Some of them allow them, and
Oh,
they allow them to have maybe, an hour every now and then, maybe every
Right.
couple of days, but for the most part, no. And that's become a problem. A lot of the kids go through like a mini withdrawal.
Well, because it's an addiction. I mean, it really,
I think I would
truly.
you know what? You ever lose your phone or you misplace it? Like you
Oh my
go
gosh,
through
it's
a
really
panic.
stressful. Yeah.
Go
It's
through a
really,
panic.
it's truly
Yeah,
stressful.
you all thought about your phones, didn't you?
Yeah, everybody was like,
You just
where
thought
is
about
my
them.
phone?
I know you did. I know
Yeah.
you did. Because I just thought of mine for a moment. Like, did I
Yeah,
leave it?
I was like, I
Did
think mine's in the green room. Yeah.
So it's a landscape that's really harder to navigate through. But I think the more independent a thinker you are, and the more confidence. This is something I tell all parents. Even if you're not sure, just behave in a confident way.
That's my MO of life and everything I do.
You're not
though.
going to have all the answers.
Just fake it. Yeah.
Well, how would you, right?
Yeah.
Every new situation, and your daughter's going to be really challenging and smart, and just. But if you can show them that someone's in control, not arbitrary or just using power in the wrong way, but that it's going to be okay. We're going to be okay.
Right.
And their anxiety calms down. They know they have a leader in the house,
Right.
which is good.
It's amazing.
Calm them down. Calm them
Well, so
down.
I want to know other tips because this is my free therapy hour of our conversation. A friend has some. I think the culture of overwhelm is a real thing, which you talk about, in the book. That sort of that idea of that, and I think that idea of your lack of agency in your day-to-day work, and that you don't have control over your schedule, and you have all these demands coming in, especially at a senior level. You would think that as you're getting more senior in your career, that you have more autonomy and sort of authority around your schedule and control. But now, because everything's coming at you all the time and the device is going off, and in a client service business, certainly you have people who expect to hear back from you immediately.
That's
and
right.
they have this expectation of access that
That's the new normal, right?
Yeah, and it's the way you keep clients or the way you keep patients or anything else.
That's right.
How do you
It's a
deal
great
with that?
question.
Where do you start?
Yeah, now I'm gonna go to Paul Napper in a minute with some of that because that's more in your space. But I can say that some of the kids are actually feeling it in their classrooms because they're sitting longer, they're getting more information at earlier ages, they're being tested and measured more frequently. I think for the parents I work with, incredibly difficult job obviously is that they've got to stop multitasking. And I know that doesn't seem possible. I do it all the time.
That's like
I do it all the time, and I get in trouble for it. So I'm carrying laundry down with this and this, and so I'm trying to do all these pieces at once, and I do more of them badly. There's something really mindful and pleasurable about being able to just take one sort of moment and just focus on one thing, and maybe just kick one or two to the curb. And then it's really our expectations, our belief systems, which gets to a thing called manage emotions and beliefs, which is our fifth principle. I think the hardest one, just because that's really what's stopping like the better behaviors and ideas that we have to lead our lives better. You can model for other people how to be a healthier person. You can enlist other people to help you manage and control the amount of stimulation coming at you.
Right.
And you're right, just on the surface, people are going to get anxious thinking, there's no way I would survive in 21st century with my clients if I decided to say, hey, only available this hour or that hour. But if you don't find a way and get comfortable with it, more and more of your disk space gets eaten up in your head. You can't think clearly. You're more likely to speed up your thinking. We talk a lot about Dan Kahneman in the book, Fast Thinking, Slow Thinking. Fast and Slow Thinking is the name of the book. And just all the stimulation we get gets our brain going faster, more emotional, and less accurate thinking. Paul, do you have a thought about?
Yeah, what I would say about that is I see it with my clients a lot. They ask me, these are all working professionals, and they're all overwhelmed with the volume of email and all kinds of messaging. And, so I think it's unique to each person. I mean, each person has to make some decisions for themselves about how much is too much and how they're going to manage this in their lives. And so there's a need to set limits. There's a need to get support from other sources as much as you can. If you have people who work under you, to get their help in this stuff. I know one executive I've worked with. She tries to manage the information coming in by asking her staff to pre-filter everything, to come in, with having digested raw information and have a perspective on it, and don't just deliver things into her and expect her to begin sorting everything out. So I mean, I think it's become a really essential thing, but it's we all have to acknowledge our limits first and foremost. I mean, and if we look to our right and look to our left and we just assume everybody else is doing it, so it thus must just be okay and normal, and I guess I just need to get with the program. That's not really the best approach. You really need to think about what's best for you to be, what do you need to be at your best each and every day, and start with that, and then work backwards and think, well, so what needs to be true in order for me to be at my best? And
do you find patterns in gender of like women? Because I feel like most of the women I know are much more feeling like I have to do it all. Right, like, and just even the women executives, the women, like the women that we work with in our new business, the women founders, they are like, well, no, I could give this to somebody else or an assistant, but I'll just take care of it. I'll do all of it. Maybe because of lack of funding or like not wanting to spend the money on getting they just feel like they have to do it all. Are you seeing that? The men seem much more willing to hand off things. It's been an interesting pattern.
That is very much in keeping with what I see as well. And I call it the superwoman phenomenon. I mean, it actually worries me because I work with many very, very talented women, and most of them are working way too hard and taking on way too much. And we actually have data on the health implications of this. And what's not commonly known is some of the cardiac issues that women are experiencing at a younger and younger age. And it's a real problem, and it's related to the stress that women are under. And I think you're onto something quite important there, which is that women are sort of trained early on to be the caretakers, to make sure everyone else is okay and everything's going smoothly, and that's you got to be careful of that. There, in some ways, I try to coach the women I work with to be a bit more entitled and to think a little more selfishly about what they really need. And I think you're right. I think on average, men do that more readily.
Yeah.
So, in some ways, maybe learn from that. But on the other hand, I do know some female executives who are doing this really well, who hand off a lot of things and who really don't take on too much,
Right.
and they're still quite successful. So, but it's hard. It's a hard one. I think it's something that requires, I think, really some deeper reflection on, what am I trying to do in my life professionally? Where do I find myself? What do I need? What resources are available to me? What happens if I say no to this or to that? I mean, does everything fall apart? Really kind of asking some of those deeper questions.
Right.
There's a lot of fear that it keeps people from making the changes that they might be able to. So when you think about it, I was listening to you speak, belief systems have to be challenged. That things are not going to fall apart if I push back a little bit.
Right.
Worst case scenarios are not going to happen, and that's where, again, thinking about, I'm operating every day on certain assumptions. I mean, they're shortcuts that we use. Our beliefs should be updated when possible. If there's new information, we should be able to sort of explore if whether or not we can adjust them from time to time. So that, because if you're having stress, if you're unhappy, if you're anxious, these are all natural reactions to not being able to adapt to things that are happening around you too quickly. And, it's built into the system. So keep that in mind, and we all have to be careful not to sedate them or just go to screens and tune out, or just really reflect and maybe challenge some of the assumptions that we're under. What kind of work life do I really have? Is this really optimal for who I am as a person? Am I checking in with my body signals?
Right.
Or am I just sort of like, skipping lunch and it doesn't matter, or I'm incredibly tired and it doesn't matter, I'm just going to continue?
I think it's interesting because I feel like everybody feels like that's a sign of weakness.
That's right.
And really what you're saying is like that's a sign of agency. I mean, that's what you have to do.
Strength
But
and
it's a sign
health.
of strength. But I think it's so hard to see it that way because our culture, I mean, certainly in the tech world, but my husband's an interventional cardiologist, ironically, and his profession, I mean, it's a complete sense of overwhelm. Like there's so much happening. There's so many demands on their profession, and if you can't keep up, you feel like you're failing in some way. And then there's real life consequences, right, of his profession, not so much of mine. But there's, it just, you feel like you have to, and in the tech world, it's like you gotta hack it and you gotta break things and like do the, like that sort of that bro-y culture that I think a lot of us are opting out of and being like, that's just not for me. But
we're not questioning the systems we're in. These systems are running really fast and they're getting more complex. Information age is and digital devices just move this more quickly. We measure everything.
Yeah.
These are sort of the drivers of all this anxiety. The United States is one of the most anxious places on the planet, according to World Health Organization.
so crazy.
And
that's not just because of our current administration.
yeah,
it's just like
no, it is perhaps a little
it might be
higher
ratcheted
these
up a little
days.
bit.
But no, that's actually a really good question, because when we talk about that, that's what a lot of people wonder. Like, well, these have been crazy times, and the news cycles are overstimulating, and what's going to happen in our country? Yes, that's going on, but it predates that. There's, it's funny because it's been very anecdotal for folks like Paul and I, because in psychology, people get to know you, they do tell you how they're doing. When we see people like, how you doing? Oh, I'm great. But truthfully, so in a lot of ways, we get access, it's privileged access to sort of the truer lives of what people are dealing with. And so we've seen this uptick, but there's really good surveys every year. There's the American Psychological Association does a Stress in America survey. And it's like this thing just keeps climbing. How stressed are you? How much time do you have with your family? How much time are you on devices? And we're seeing it climb in kids as well. But researchers have actually been looking at anxiety in the United States since the 1930s, using a particular type of really strong psychometrically valid instrument. It's from the MMPI. If you've ever taken this, you'll know it's 400 to 500 items, and your eyes will cross. And you probably have never seen it, but pieces of it you might see in other types of instruments that are used in psychological assessment. So they give these out every year to norm them and see what's going on in the population. Somebody had a really great idea of let's sort of track and see on different scales how people are doing. One of the scales is really a measure of anxiety, different types of anxiety. It kicked up somewhere in the 1950s, but not as high as it is now. And then in the 1980s, it went really super high, and it's just been climbing since. And so, in the 50s, you wonder, like, what was happening in the 50s? It looked like the highway system was happening, and everybody was driving, and people were moving out to the suburbs. There was fragmentation in the culture.
The suburbs would totally stress me out.
Yeah, yeah.
They really would. Like, moving to the suburbs.
So
Sorry, keep going.
That's fine. And then the 80s was more like the information age was really up and running.
Right.
So we've been watching this, and but the real takeaway statistic that has always disturbed me is beginning in the 1980s, the average school-age child, just a typical kid, has levels of clinical anxiety that are the same, if not higher, than child psychiatric patients of the 1950s.
That's crazy.
That's the norm. That's just the average.
That's like your baseline.
And by the way, we do too to some degree. In other words, we are like canaries in a coal mine. But we are incredibly amazing creatures. We can adapt, but there are costs.
Right.
So again, when you do feel fatigued, when you feel off your game, when you feel like you're just sort of joining the herd and just giving in, chances are, certainly if you feel anxious, these are all the sort of signals and signs of you have a decline in your agency. You're not making your own choices. You're not pausing and reflecting. You're not putting yourself on a path that makes sense just for you.
Right. So then what do we do?
Yeah. By the way, one of them.
How do we address
when
it?
you were speaking about sort of in the office thing, our third one is move. I'm a little out of order. There's 7 of them, but
Okay, wait. So list them out because I feel like I need to know
controls. Maybe I'll run through them really quickly so you have sort of a frame for it. And by the way,
Yes.
think of them not as sort of from top to bottom. Think of them like on a wheel or a clock.
Okay.
And I'm starting with one. It's not necessarily the one that you'll use all the time, but it's a great place to start. Control stimuli is number 1, which is, your brain can't function optimally, can't think for itself. You can't make great decisions if you're rushed, if you're stressed, if the bandwidth isn't good because it's stuffed with so much information. So that seems kind of logical. It's a good starting point. Like, and we got to get that down first. The next thing is about the relationships that we have. Associate selectively is what we call principle number 2. It turns out that when we're next to other people or close to other people, we pick up on their cues of stress, anxiety, depression.
Sure, yeah.
You spend time with somebody
Right.
who's like bummed out about something, you want to be a
Yeah.
good friend, you're down for a while. We have mirror neurons. We actually neurologically pick up the signals and we replicate them in our own heads. It's what allows us to be herd animals, to be able to join together, to be able to share emotions and have compassion and empathy.
Right.
But at the same time, be aware of who you're around. So we go to great lengths in that chapter to
Well,
sort of...
don't they say that it's like you're the sum of the 5 people you spend the most
Yes,
time with or something? There's some
exactly.
stat like that I
That's
think
right.
is
You could
actually...
and you could almost
Sure.
like plot that out.
Yeah.
Think about like, who do I spend time with? We have family, we have obligations. We all have different tolerance levels to how much we can handle, but it's very subtle, and it's usually unconscious. But thinking about who you're around, it also affects your ability to learn and have new ideas and new possibilities.
Right.
So again, that's number 2. The third one, which we were kind of surprised this one popped up, was move. We call it move, but it's about physical movement. It could be vigorous movement. It could be changing the position of your seat. It could be fidgeting. It could be walking over to a window. It's just freeing yourself up, your body, to be able to explore the whole space it's in. Certainly getting healthy exercise is unbelievably important for brain functions, paired with rest, relax. This is the part where, in modern society, right, we don't go for it. Like, you can't nap, you can't slow down, you can't take a vacation.
Right.
That pairing that, and also think about nutrition. So think about the whole person, the sort of
And that's all
biological.
under move.
That's all under
all
move.
of that, okay.
Under move. And we find that when people feel trapped, if you're stressed and stuck, you're behind a screen and you're trying to work something out and it's not working for you, don't just sit there. Literally get up and just stand.
Yeah.
Stand at your desk if you can. Stretch, but tell yourself consciously, I'm doing this. And we do this with kids who are in chairs long periods of time in school. We talk with teachers when we go to different types of schools around the country, like, look, let them get up, let them walk out, let them go down the hallway.
Right.
Put a yoga mat down, let's do some breathing, let's do some mindfulness, and just sort of like shake it up a little bit. And there's now evidence that when they come back from it, their brain is functioning better.
It's so interesting.
It's
I
like
mean,
a
I
freedom.
feel like so many of these things, I know you're only on number 3, but even
number 3,
that, I mean, so much of this is sort of institutionalized at places like Google. I feel like
Yeah.
they have all this research.
They do there.
And people
They do
just
there.
do it, and you don't even realize. But I think
There's a lot of forward thinking happening.
a lot
in
of
some
my
companies,
work
but most-
habits have come from places like that, where these things
That's
they
right.
seem so obvious to me, but I'm
That's
realizing they come from some of these cultures that are
They're open
creating,
to it.
ironically, the stresses of our lives. You know, they're creating this other attention piece, and
Yeah.
you know, like sort of grabbing the attention, but on the other hand,
Yeah.
have also created great work
No,
habits.
and they're just more open to it.
Yeah.
And then, there's now working meetings. A lot of people have talked about that. 2 or 3 people, let's walk, let's get outside, let's
Oh yeah,
walk
I do
around.
that all the time. I take
Do you?
walking meetings all the time. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I really like that. People think I'm weird when I first started to do it. I'm like, you want to take a walk? And they're like, okay. Like it just, but like when I did my one-on-ones with my team, if we didn't need to be in front of a computer, like if she wasn't showing me
Terrific.
something, I'm like,
Very
well,
forward.
if it's not today, I mean, this weather, not so great for walking meeting, but even so, but we'd just take a walk around the block and sort of do laps. They thought I was crazy.
This is related to move, and I might as well touch on it now because I may forget it later as we move on to the other ones. But some of you have probably heard of learned helplessness. Maybe Martin Seligman's famous research from back in the day, where electric shocks in the cages of animals where they couldn't move would eventually just give up and stop trying to escape. Even when you gave them an opportunity to, they would just sort of take it. And it became a model, we think, for how depression might work. You move from sort of being sort of stressed and anxious, and you can't do anything with it, and then you slowly give up, and you go from hopelessness to helplessness. If you're sitting for long hours and you're stressed, it's like a version of learned helplessness. So if
but you
just
just don't get up.
Yeah, just literally just any kind of movement would be great. Any kind of movement would be great. That was number 3. Number 4 is position yourself as a learner. People with higher agency, we found, could sort of tamp down their power when necessary. They could listen to other people. They weren't chatting as much as I am right now. They were listening as much as they could to get as many viewpoints and ideas as possible. They were interested in information over their own self-esteem or their self-image.
Love that.
Position yourself as a learner, really terrific. And that's hard in today's sort of performance-measured kind of society. It's really, really hard to allow people to do that. Get in there. You're not asking enough questions. You're not showing us that you're really smart.
Right.
The 5th one, which is sort of front and center with the work I do, I'm a cognitive behavioral psychologist, is manage your emotions and your beliefs. And I say this a lot of times. I think in the book you'll find that to be a very, very deep chapter that has a lot of great information, but it may not be the easiest one for many people, but I think it's one of the strongest. So our beliefs often drive our emotions, but it happens so quickly we don't quite know it. This is where some of the cognitive science comes from, or has been going. So we have a particular action, and we have a feeling about it, and what we don't know is that we have a belief system probably underneath it that's been telling us sort of like, choose that, don't do that. And from time to time, sort of again, slowing our thinking down, going from fast thinking, which is emotional, to slower thinking. And we give examples and toolkit items in the book and examples of how people use this. You then begin to sort of challenge a few of those beliefs. In this situation, does this make sense? Maybe I should broaden that. Maybe I've been too judgmental this way or not. We look at our biases, because then you can actually change your emotions and control them better. And the next one, number 6, is check your intuition, which I touched on earlier. It's like, you sort of rounded through the first 3 or more what we call behavioral practices. They're sort of in your immediate control. You can control stimuli. You can associate selectively, decide who you're around. You can move. Those are things like more in your conscious control. But then you move into these other ones, we call them cognitive. So a little bit more elusive. Position yourself as a learner. Manage your emotions and beliefs, certainly. Check your intuition. Intuition is something that some people seem to just do really, really well. And we're not talking about just, oh yeah, I just had this intuition, I just went with it. That's impulsivity. But actually can reflect, pause, and there's different types, and we cover them in the book. And some require you just take a break and sleep on it, so to speak, do an activity that's completely unrelated, knowing that you're going to check in with yourself later. When kids are going off to look at colleges or private schools, for example, I'll have them do that. The parents are looking at the rankings or the brochures or whatever, and I said, you know what? Just you go, and you're going to just absorb it.
You'll know.
Look at the kids. Look at the buildings.
Yeah.
The next day, just check in with yourself. Can you see yourself there? So it's sort of like let that data sort of simmer in and bubble up to the surface. We call it check your intuition, because we just don't want people just, here's some intuition to help inform what I'm about to do. You don't want to be impulsive, so keep it in check as well. And then the sort of the last one, the 7th one, is where it all comes together, is deliberate then act. We are the sum of all the decisions we make. And so we think that those first 6 really do prepare us to then, do we have a framework to work from when we're making decisions? Are we so rushed by the stimulation or the people around us that make us anxious or expect things from us, or we haven't learned enough, or we're tense? Are we making the best decisions, or are we kind of rushing through? Are we fearful? Are we pausing too much? Are we obsessing?
Right.
That's another great but heavy chapter. But in there are various examples of experts that we interviewed. So we interviewed like a Superior Court judge, who's retired. How do you make, that's an expert decision maker. Someone's the head of intelligence at the Boston Police Department, particularly after the Boston Marathon bombing. Flies all over the world and does best practices on how to make decisions and training things around sort of how to handle terrorist issues. We talked with Jerome Grutman, who you may know of. Has written for the New Yorker extensively, New York Review of Books. In fact, I think he has something out just recently on immunology, which I need to read. And he wrote a book a few years back, How Doctors Think. So we were in his office and we were chatting with him, and he was like kind enough to spend this time with us. So we're curious, you're an expert decision maker. You have to do diagnosis. Your husband's an expert decision maker. We think how do you do this? So he said he was interested in that a number of years ago, and he went to all his colleagues and said, so what's your system? How do you make decisions? Have you thought about how you make decisions? He said not one of the people he checked in with could answer the question.
Interesting.
Yeah. So in other words, don't feel bad if you don't know that you're not aware of your decision making. Even experts often don't. Yeah. No, you would think they would. You would think
they're using their intuition. They're checking in with their intuition.
Good point. Very, very good. They have their expert intuition, so by then they're not. But that does increase the rate of error because you can miss something. He said that within the first, I forget, how many seconds was it, a diagnosis is made. They often interrupt their patients, most physicians within a couple of seconds. Something under a minute, I think, maybe 30 seconds.
Yeah, it was. It was I think, 30 seconds or something like that. And interestingly, his wife is a physician also. So
Pam Hartzman.
And they collaborated on a book together, which is quite good. And he credits her for, partially for getting him interested in this whole line of inquiry, because she is a really great decision maker. She weaves her intuition in, but she's also she's got a very defined kind of process, decision-making process, where she tests out her hypotheses. She's more aware of her assumptions. And so really the chapter in the book, Deliberate Then Act, is all about being more aware of how you make decisions, be more conscious of that, and especially for larger decisions that you may need to make in your life, you really want to be more aware of how you're making that decision.
So is there a supposition that there is a right or wrong decision in that framework, or is it just to make a decision that she's super decisive and just sticks with it?
No, great question. I think that there is the idea is that your hit rate will go up in terms of accuracy in making a better life choice for yourself, whatever the decision may be, whether it's a diagnosis for a patient or whether it's a choice in your personal life or work life, that you'll make a better decision, that's more accurate if you slow things down and you're more aware of how you're making the decision, which is thinking through what assumptions am I making, what data do I have, what is my intuition telling me, and we can't slow things down for each and every decision we make through the course of every day. That would be unrealistic. But for big ticket items, we found with some of our really high functioning clients that a lot of them were rushing through things they really shouldn't rush through, and really kind of regretting some of the decisions they'd made after. So it's a way of slowing things down, putting deeper thought and reflection into the process, and so that's really, I think, as you were saying. But Jerry Grutman's done some amazing work on this, on how doctors think, and that's exactly what he said. He said, surprisingly, not all these renowned physicians had a really hard time articulating how they make decisions. Yeah. They'd never been asked that question. And now, interestingly, he and his wife are teaching Harvard Medical School students. They have a course now that was an outgrowth of all this work they did. They're teaching Harvard Medical School students about what psychologists call metacognition, which is basically, how do you think? Right. It's thinking about how you think. And so they're now training medical school students at Harvard to give more thought to how they think. And really, this is an outgrowth of all the complexity. I mean, there's no way that a physician, I mean, as intelligent and as experienced as a physician is, there's no way they can keep up with all the information.
Well, I feel like, I mean, that's a pretty unique profession in that there really are dire consequences if you make the wrong decision. I feel like in most other professions, there's probably not as dire, or not just professions, but in life. And so is it terrible that I kind of go with what's the worst that can happen? Like, I'm just going to go ahead and do it. Because that truly is how I make a lot of decisions. I'm like, kind of like my curiosity is taking me here.
Yeah.
I'm just going to go ahead and do that. And that really is because like the consequences of it, you know, I'm not like reckless, but it's just, you know, it's just like do it. You just go ahead and do it. And like, you can always unwind it if it goes terribly wrong.
You don't believe that you've closed a
Phew.
door, right? You haven't like closed a door and you'll never be able to go back. You don't have that kind of belief system.
Not
apparently.
really. I think
No.
if I do, it's doors that I've been, like when I left my law firm days, you know, it was like,
That's big.
I'm okay with that door being closed. If it means like I'm not going to be a partner at a law firm, like that's okay.
I can
Like
live with that.
Yes, there's certain decisions that I've made, you know, that I'm very clear on what I'm
Right.
closing off and I'm very okay with those decisions. But for the most part, it's kind of like it'll directionally correct. Yeah, thank you. Just playing that. I feel like-
I think time-wise, we are near questions.
Yeah,
If,
it'd be
we
great
could-
Let's
to-
make a
would love to.
decision to.
Let's
open
make
We
a
are now
decision.
using our decision-making skills.
So
Would love to hear from you guys.
I see impulsive actions already in the house with hands going up. Deliberate and then act. And then deliberate how short a question you can actually ask and still get the point across. Do we have a deal? And there's some very persistent, impulsive people in the room. So great. So we have a question in the first row and a question in the third row, if we get microphones to them. Ali, can we have the microphone down here, please, in the third row over here? And, oh, Paul, we'll need your microphone. Okay, let's take you in the first row, sir. And then we need a microphone to this lady here. Ali, over here. Just pass it through. Thanks.
Yeah, my question is for Dr. Rao. I was very intrigued by the different parts of the wheel you started to explain. Could you explain the others, please?
Yeah, those are the 7. So, you know, again, it goes control stimuli, associate selectively, and move. 3 behavioral types, and then 4 cognitive. So then it goes into the position self as learner, manage emotions and beliefs, check your intuition, deliberate, then act. So they're sort of like in a wheel. We do believe they relate with one another, but we just didn't want to put them in sort of a hierarchy. Usually things we see are in lists, and it didn't make sense to do it that way. And I think that starting out in the behavioral ones, particularly control stimuli, although a lot of people will say that's in many ways the hardest thing to do now in the information age, but even small amounts of separating yourself from screens and digital devices is extraordinary. Pairing it with move is great because outdoor time is usually non-screen time, have you noticed? And it's also non-sedentary time. Usually you have to move about. And you have these more multi-sensory experiences where there's wind and you know, on your face, and you hear things in 3 dimensions. It's a very, very different. Your brain just lights up, just loves it. Yeah.
One point I wanted to make about the deliberate then act principle, which is that we specifically, in terms of deliberate then act, we specifically wanted to separate the deliberation process or thinking, reflecting process from the taking action process. And because we're all receiving messages more and more these days to just take action, you know, do this. And we live in a very sped up kind of culture, and you know, we generally things work out better for us when we engage in a little bit more thinking before we take action. So that's why that final, you know, really and most important principle is called deliberate, then act.
There's a comma after deliberate.
There's a comma.
Actually implies that you take a pause. Yes, ma'am.
Forgive my ignorance, I'm not really familiar with your body of work, but I think it might be helpful if you would just define what you mean by agency.
No, you are onto something there. It's one of the words that people immediately think of an ad agency, you know, a law firm or something like that. You know, if you look at some dictionary examples, one of the things it'll tell you is being able to act as an agent for yourself, being able to act, being able to take charge, to control, and
Exert power.
exert power, absolutely.
On your own behalf.
Putting yourself on a path that makes sense. You know, so it's a, you know, we kind of use the phrase a little bit. We would all love a more agentic life. You know,
Agentic.
agentic. Yeah.
That's a good, is that a real word?
You know what? I
It
look it
is?
up and I see.
It is now.
It is now because I keep using it. It's I think yes, I've
An
seen it,
agentic life.
and I've looked at it and I have
like
it, but
that.
I just love the sound of it.
Yeah, I do
You
too.
heard it at
I
the
totally thought
Rubin
you made it up.
first. So you can take it out in the world. Did we see a hand up in the back? Yes, there's a gentleman in the second last row. And who else would like to ask a
This
question?
gal up
Yes,
here
ma'am,
is
just
better.
next here.
Hi, I'm Mohit. I loved your discussion about decision making. There is a line of thought that says that within a day or a finite amount of time, the capability to make decisions is somewhat finite. Right? What are your thoughts about it? And how does that?
I can tell you how I can have a high schooler that's applying to college and trying to make a decision between two schools. It feels absolutely enormous. I have kids who are maybe in the middle school range who are deciding should they go with the town team or for the school league, and they have different implications, or should I choose this camp or that? Every decision can feel like it's your last one. So we do a little time travel. So we do a thing where we close our eyes and we try to imagine what's it like a week from now, what's it like a month from now, a year from now, 5 years, 10 years. Kids are terrific at this. It's harder for us to do it. But if you thought about it, if you could actually get into a time machine and just go a little bit into the future and look back, I mean, a lot of the things that you look back on, the decisions were not as big as you thought. Another way that I frame it for people is each door you open, it should be a two-way door. You should be able to go back perhaps. There are mid-course corrections sometimes. You now have all these other doors in front of you.
Yeah.
It's like multiple possibilities. It's constant. But it's more of that perception ahead of time.
Yeah.
But I think his question too was about, do we have a hard, is there a certain point at which making a decision, we're exhausted through making decisions, and this is pretty important. Kahneman did a lot of research on this, and one of his findings, Kahneman and Tversky, was that we all prefer fast thinking as human beings. We like to make decisions quickly, more intuitively, some would say impulsively, because the reason for that is simple, because it takes a lot more energy to make to give greater thought to something. It takes, and we can study that. We have studied this, and our brains eat up the vast amount of energy that our bodies produce. So there's times during the day when you're going to be a better decision maker, and those would be clearly times in the morning, provided that you're awake and not sleep deprived. After lunch, after you've had a meal. We need a lot of calories in our body to make good decisions. So if you're not well nourished, if you're sleep deprived, clearly if you're emotionally stressed, you're not going to be at your best in terms of decision making. So we need to prime ourselves really for better decision making.
It's about 20% of the body's resources go to the brain, which is a lot. I think it's in terms of organs, it's one that's just really tapping out most of your energy. Yeah, thank you.
Now, next question over here in the throat.
Hello. When you were talking about the lives of children, I have to admit I got very anxious myself. And so I'm glad that you worked your way through sort of some solutions. But I wonder if, developmentally speaking, there's room in the school curriculum for things like metacognition and agency, and have you seen anything like that?
In some of the more progressive and forward-thinking schools, we were just recently invited to a school system that's just right outside of Boston to do it's a 3-class workshop with the teachers. Got them the book, and we're walking them through it, and they could apply this immediately to their classrooms at all different ages. Usually when you're talking metacognition, it's probably a little bit in the sort of 10, 11, and 12 and up kind of group. Depends. But that's where I would and there's a lot of talk about meta learning as well, like what's your learning style and how do you learn best. But all of the other ones, particularly the earlier ones, are really perfect for the educational setting. So I think that these can all be, modified based on, the developmental level or age that the kids are at. And they should be integrated into the school systems, absolutely. Campus, yes, from the camp thing. That's right.
There's a summer camp program called Camp Quest that's designed specifically for children to build greater agency and to
Critical
question
thinking.
assumptions and become better critical thinkers. Called Camp Quest. They have camps in 12 different states, and it's kind of an interesting camp program. If you're so inclined, but it's called Camp Quest.
Yep.
Campquest.org.
Yeah,
So
that's
again,
right.
it's a summer camp. They have regular summer activities as well.
It wasn't just critical thinking.
Right.
Just critical thinking for
Thanks,
8-year-olds.
thanks, Mom and Dad. This
Yeah.
is great, yeah.
My kid's going to be
Yeah.
super psyched when I tell her what she's doing this summer.
So our next two questions in the second row first and then the third.
Hi. My question is just regarding the study that you made. Like, what was the design kind of? Like, who were the people
It's a
who
great
answered
question.
your questions, and
Yeah.
like, what were you trying to find, and what was presented to them as agency? Were you trying to find how much of an agency they feel they have, the sense that, yeah. Just
It's a great question. I'll try to cover that succinctly. Our approach was more of the classic case study approach because we're practitioners. We do more applied psychology. But along the way, once we got to the principles that we believed we were seeing in 20, 30 years each, we then sort of wanted to put that a bit to the test. So we devised an inventory of what we thought were the practices that we were hearing from people that we felt had the lowest anxiety, were showing agency, because there really is no measure of agency yet. We're going to be working, we think, on that in the next year or so to come. But we have an inventory that we tested on about, I think it was something like 300 people to sort of see whether or not the different items made sense if they hung together. We used psychometric analysis in order to sort of bring that to its best point, and then we piloted it again to get some sort of sense of norms. And in fact, on our website, which is powerofagency.com, you can take the first of it. It's in the book. The inventory is in the front part of the book. We thought it would be nice for people to have a way to sort of plot themselves on where do I fall on these principles, where maybe I need some extra work, or I'm really good at this, I want to spend more time on it because I'm enjoying it, but to sort of like gauge where they're at. But you can do the first one is online, and it'll score it for you and give you some feedback. So we're at that stage where now we'd like to move more into reliability studies and validity studies, but that's going to be sort of next steps. Interestingly, the inventory we had did correlate with measures of what we believe are agency, so self-efficacy scales and hopefulness scales. So those correlated nicely. So we know we're on the right direction. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, question in the third row.
Hi. I was wondering whether or not you'd found any statistical correlation between having an older parent and having more anxiety, that children with older parents in general have more anxiety than children with younger parents.
That's a very interesting. Anecdotally, I would say yes. In my experience, you would I would guess there is data out there that could support that. I don't have that accessible right now to be thinking about, but I can tell you anecdotally, that does seem to be what we're experiencing. It sounds counterintuitive on the outside, like wouldn't older parents be better? They're more experienced. The stakes are higher. There's something about being a younger parent and being more fluid and maybe impulsive yourself and lighthearted that lets you get through moments that can be terrifying, that may actually not add up to much in the long run. But as we do get older and we have a greater database of knowledge and expectations of success, we do tend to manage a lot more. Yeah. It's a great question. Great question.
These are all great questions. Yes, the next question.
I have a question for Anjali. Did you have any suggestions or techniques with your background from Google and dealing with, C-level and high-powered people and many stakeholders, when we're talking about this power of agency and when you're thinking through how best for you to operate in your role and have a work-life balance, do you have any techniques or in terms of introducing that in a gentle way in the workplace, especially when you're dealing with people, hierarchy that are above you, you know, in terms of things that you've found that are good for yourself that you want to express or introduce that into this is the way I'm trying to work, or this is the way I'm trying to operate for my health and to also help others in the workplace?
It's really tough. I mean, it's a really hard thing to do. I think the first thing is to dissuade yourself of the idea that there is such a thing as work-life balance. I feel like that is a false bill of goods that have been sold to women to make us feel inadequate and guilty and stressed out and all the rest of it, because I don't think there is such a thing. I think there is such a thing as having it all. You just can't have it all at the same time. Like it just, you have to, you know, it's pie. It's not balance. It's a pie, and you'll have different wedges of the pie allotted to different things. So I think first just give yourself that permission to be okay with that. And that takes a lot of the work. And then I think it's just modeling it, right? Like it's just saying, you know, it's being clear about like, this is how I do things. And it doesn't mean you have to call people out that you're doing this stuff or call it out necessarily, but just sort of just model it just by doing it. And, you know, scheduling little things like, I would make a point of making when I got to a senior enough level, I didn't do this so much at Google necessarily, but when I got to more senior positions at Warby Parker and at Cheddar, I would make my calendar, personal appointments public on my calendar, not like, you know, if they're, I mean, depending on the nature of how private they were, but things like if I had, you know, something for my daughter's school, I would put that on my calendar and make sure that my team could see that. And I would make a point of wildly leaving the office, being like, oh, I'm going to go run and pick up Zia because, you know, my nanny's sick or whatever. Like I would just do those things to give them the signal that that was okay to do, that it was okay to have a mixed bag of priorities, and that I could still be a really effective employee and senior leader of the company, but still have all these other things going on. And so I hope that I model, even though they didn't have children, you know, the folks on my team were quite a bit younger than me and didn't have children or have those obligations, but I think just signaling to them that that's okay, and that there are women executives in particular that do those things, and we don't all have a stay-at-home spouse or a nanny or full, you know, all that care at home to help with those things was important, and I hope that I've given them permission to do the same. But I don't know that there's not a great solution. Yeah.
I've got a question of the first row. And does anybody want to ask a question in the back? Yes, we'll get this microphone to you. Thank you. Yeah. Also to you later. Yeah.
Hi, I'm a therapist, and I was wondering where emotionality fits into what we're talking about. So I'm thinking about like things I work with people, like people who feel guilty about making certain choices, people who live with regret about the choices they made, and all the things where they begin to not trust their agency, or they see limitations in their agency. They don't even know what's their own and what's they've been told is theirs. You know, all the conflicted emotional and you know, and things that people want to have agency over that they don't have agency over. Things that are going on in the world, like a lot of young people, I'm sure you know this, are despairing about the direction of the world and the climate and the future, and feeling like they have no agency over those things.
Yeah. I would say that, you know, some people are going to have a longer road to build their agency. Yeah, I'm a cognitive behavioral trained therapist, so, and I was very uncomfortable in the beginning, sort of using those techniques, particularly, you know, I was seeing kids early on at, you know, like Children's Hospital, had, you know, chronic medical problems, and you know, some of them, you know, may not be living very long, and, you know, very, very serious situations, working in, you know, parts of the city where there's a lot of trauma. But I was really impressed with some of the more simple sort of behavioral techniques. Early on I did some biofeedback for stress management, and just getting some of the kids a little bit of control over what their body was doing and reacting to get some of that adrenaline down and cortisol down. That was a game changer for them. And so for younger clients, in a lot of ways, they're more amenable to these simpler techniques. They're concrete. And showing them that a change can take place. And in a lot of anxiety work, exposure therapy is now considered really a great treatment of choice versus sort of just trying to use analytic techniques to keep approaching the issue and talking about it, because there may not be sort of a way for the brain to know what to do with it by, say, the end of the hour. There's greater insight and knowledge, but there may not be some tools for them to sort of manage what their body's physiological response is going to be to all that information. So I would say a really nice pairing of insight work with those folks, and then really very simple tools that they can practice when they're outside the office. At least that's what I found in my experience. It seems to work for these types of cases. But some of the situations are going to be tricky, as you know. Thank you for the question.
I would add one quick thing to that, which is that isolation is sort of the kryptonite for agency. So in terms of emotions, managing emotion, agency is always expressed in the context of our social relationships. So for patients, for clients who are struggling with difficult feelings, if to the extent they're isolated, that is really problematic. And so trying to get them to engage in some relaxation, things that Tony's talking about, but also trying to help them break any isolation they have, getting them to join a group, getting them engaging. One of the sort of premises of our book is there's a lot of unused capacity for agency in the world. And we need to find it. And we need to start exercising it, because we do have it. But to the extent we're isolated, it really makes us feel much worse always. And it disconnects us from our agency. So something to think about.
So we're going to connect with 3 last questions, in the third row, and in the middle of the house, I believe, and then we have the back row. Okay, yes, sir.
Yeah, well, that was kind of what I wanted to talk about too, is the idea of isolation. Did you look at kind of purpose, impact, gratitude, things external to the sense of the identity of agency, and how maybe stepping beyond yourself could, address most of the things you were talking about, I think, in your book. Not to negate them, they all sounded amazing, but maybe just how looking external could also be maybe the best remedy to internal sense of agency.
It's a great question, too.
It's a really good question.
Do you want to field that one? Yeah, that's like one.
Book 2.
That's book 2, yeah.
Well, I mean, agency is about taking action, ultimately. I think what our book is about is certain things you can do to build greater agency so that you can then take action in your life. So it's a brilliant question, because I think at the end of the day, agency is about acting on your environment. And so what we're trying to talk about here is when people have a higher sense of agency, they act in more powerful ways. They accomplish what they're trying to accomplish. They feel better while they're doing so, and that is agency. So agency is about expressing our interests, our passions, our desires, our values. So it isn't a sealed kind of thing that you feel great because wow, I have a lot of agency. In some ways, if you have a lot of agency, you're acting on your environment. You're actually doing things. You're engaging with other people. You're sharing ideas. You're getting things done. You're making a difference in some way, consistent with who you are. So that really is the ultimate task of agency. It's a great question.
I'm just also, sorry.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
I think I'm kind of more vis-a-vis maybe a third world sense of agency. We're talking about people who don't have food, who don't have water. That's real agency. We live in a world where we have all these things. So I think, oftentimes we still think so internally that, the best answer can be external to what we have. We have our needs covered. So that was kind of where I was.
But we have the highest some of the highest rates of anxiety in the world, despite everything we have. There are a lot of people who don't have anywhere near what we have or access to, who are reporting a much happier life. There's something about the stepping away from the materialism and some of the messaging, particularly in social media, and how hard we are on ourselves and our social comparisons, and how fast we're leading our lives because that's what we should. So I always do come back to that. There are a lot of people who are not are doing better with a lot less. So.
But our challenges are different. In other words, what he's saying is, I think our challenges in the United States, in the West, are, we have our own set of challenges in terms of accessing and expressing our agency. I think people in the developing world have different challenges. I mean, they have challenges that in some ways you could say are greater. They don't have, they don't have access to nutrition. They don't, they don't have access to homes, to safe, living environments, violence, all kinds of challenges. So, I mean, each society in some respects has its own unique challenges to humans. And so, essentially agency is about adaptation. It's about how do we adapt. And in some ways, I think, your point embedded in your sort of question is this idea that we're just kind of driving ourselves crazy here. I mean, and, you can look at that and say, that's, a relatively privileged society, what's wrong with us? Like, how come we're, and, those aren't bad questions. And I think in our book, we try to answer those things and try to get people, kind of onto a different path, to try to simplify things. And I think, Anjali's work is sort of in the spiritual realm, too, of just getting off the treadmill and getting out and experiencing some different things and, and discovering what matters to you. I mean, there are a lot of people who really don't even know what matters most to them. So it's hard to express agency when you're not really in touch with that. So, these are all ways of kind of developing a deeper relationship with yourself, whether it's through spiritual exploration, whether it's through some of the practices in our book. But ultimately, it's designed to take some action in your life, to affect some change and do something that's meaningful to you.
So I know there are people who would love to ask some more questions, but you do have your opportunity because the authors will be upstairs to sign their books, and I'm sure whether you buy a book or not, they'll be happy to answer further questions upstairs. But let's take the last two questions. I can't see who's got the microphone now. Yes, hello.
Hi. So you mentioned earlier differences in the feelings of overwork and stress by gender. I was curious as to your thoughts on how this is different by culture. So, just speaking for myself, I'm Indian American, come from an immigrant family, and this idea of overwork and stress was really kind of inherent in my upbringing and in the lives of my parents. So how do you approach these conversations in a culturally nuanced way?
That's for you.
You think that's for me?
Yeah.
Well, I thought that was for you.
Oh, I mean, I feel your pain. It would be my answer. Yeah. No, I think this is.
I may pass. That's a really
I'm hoping you have an answer for us.
If you're familiar with football, you've seen a punt before.
This is all for book 2. We've given you a bunch of topics for book
2.
two.
The gender.
Well, expectations are always, always drive so much. So I think in families where expectations are unreasonable, it's obviously better off to get expectations placed on kids to be more reasonable. I think in terms of the wider culture, the messaging is that we're getting, and especially for women, I think this is more, in some ways I think it's easier to be a man these days than to be a woman because
I don't think that's just these days, my friend, but I think that's like the baseline.
The messaging these days that women get is, as Anjali said, have it all, be it all, do it all. And, women are literally killing themselves these days, and there's data that supports this. enough support from other people in your life? Are you doing things, taking some time to do things in your life that replenish you, that bring you joy? So it's a lot of, in a lot of ways, it's a difficult time to be a woman these days.
Just today.
Yeah, just today. Right?
Only
Okay.
today. Tomorrow it's going to be better.
Right, we
Today it's not so.
Well, tomorrow might be better if you set your intention and act on it. And we've got an installation at the base of the spiral staircase called the Wheel of Intention, which is based on the concept of a Tibetan prayer wheel. And in a Tibetan prayer wheel, you plant your prayers inside this cylinder, and you spin it into action so that the sort of centrifugal force generates an energy that inspires the world to conspire with you to enact that intention or that prayer. And of course, the prayers are usually, or should be, prayers for others, not yourself, right? Because it's that compassion action that this belief system strives to inculcate in us all. And so upstairs at the base of the spiral staircase, you can, I'm sorry, you have to do a keyboard thing. You have to type it in, I know, and press return, and then spin the rim of the wheel. And what happens is that it's a transference of energies. So the agency of your intention implemented into words, and the kinetic energy that you create by spinning the wheel generates a dynamo inside the barrel, which sends an electrical pulse into light signals which spell out your intention on the underside of the spiral.
I love that.
And if you keep on spinning the wheel, you will send it circumambulating up the spiral staircase and
cool.
out into the world.
That's where I'm going to
So,
be after.
and then of course there's an exhibition up top called The Power of Intention, which you should really see because that's an accumulation of everybody's intentions on that floor. So I do urge you, of course, it's hard to type clutching a copy of this book, which I know all of you will be, or indeed, really hard to type if you're clutching both. But try, deliberate, maybe pass them off to a friend, and then type, and then send your intentions and share your intention with the world, because then that's your commitment. But we committed to a last question at the end of the row. Hello.
That was such a wonderful finale, I feel. I just had a question about intuition and decisions that have to be based on conditions of a situation that are counterintuitive. I don't know if that makes sense. I've had situations where my intuition said X, but the conditions involving other people besides myself made me make decisions that were counterintuitive, and I felt them afterwards. I felt the ramifications of it. And I missed the beginning of the talk, so I don't know if I'm saying something that was discussed.
No, that's a great conclusion.
Yeah, no, because I mean the first thing that jumps to me, maybe you'll think of something, is sort of the associate selectively, the second principle, which is the people that we surround ourselves will have very significant influences over our decision making, over all sorts of things, our emotional state, things like that. So it sounds like you realized that you were sort of caught between two opposing messages, and that the one that was internal, did that one, that it felt right, it wasn't an impulse, and it actually would have been the better path to follow?
For me, but not for all participants in the situation.
Right.
And as a mother, it's involved in
Yeah.
that.
Yes.
Mother, you say, well, for me, this could be really bad.
That's right.
But for everyone else, this might be the best route.
No, that's a really excellent point. That's a really excellent point. Yeah. Yeah. Would your decision have been any different looking back on it?
I think the path would have been slightly different. Maybe the decision would have been similar, but the approach and the negotiation might have been different. But yeah, definitely, it's over 10 years, maybe 20 years.
You're still thinking about it?
It influenced many things.
Yes. Right. Yeah. Yeah. That's very complex. Yeah. 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 No, it is.
So that ends at a very sort of open, open way, which I think is probably good, because leaving here with more questions than you came in with is actually meaningful, because you got some information that you now need to process. And so good luck with that. But we do need to pay, and would love to pay a little tribute to our co-authors tonight of The Power of Agency, Paul Napper and Anthony Rao, for creating this sort of path to help direct us in some of the decisions that we have to make. And so while I lied a bit at the beginning, I'm afraid, I said you couldn't necessarily take a Ganesh with you from an art museum, but you can if you get them from a shop. So, Paul, here you go, the remover of obstacles in the palm of your hand.
Thank you so much.
And the remover of obstacles at your fingertips.
That is wonderful. Thank
Tony,
you
thank you so much. And Anjali, you don't need to go around to Peru and Burning Man to stalk your gods. You can have one at your bedside table.
Amazing.
There you
Thank
go.
you.
Anjali Kumar, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you all very, very much.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.
This is so sweet.